The idea that you're going to try and do everything in one budget, which I think was our biggest failing, is fanciful and will lead to bad outcomes. I think speed can lead to bad outcomes. I know the fashion is to grip everything and get everything done in the first 100 days or whatever, but actually I would urge caution on that.
Now, Andy Burnham has announced an £850 million tax cut on energy bills to help ease the cost of living, his first significant policy as Prime Minister. From October the 1st, electricity bills will be VAT-free, saving households around £45 a year. The government says it will be funded in part by scrapping Keir Starmer's digital ID project, but Darren Jones, a Starmer loyalist sacked yesterday, immediately said that project had been unfunded, raising questions about how this will then be paid for. These will be familiar questions for my next guest, Kwasi Kwarteng, who arrived in office as Liz Truss's chancellor, promising to spend tens of billions of pounds to keep energy bills down after the start of the war in Ukraine. Kwasi, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for being with us. Look, what do you make of the choice of John Healey as chancellor? I understand you saw it coming.
Yeah, well, I think it was smart politically, because the problem they had was if one section of the party would be very upset if Ed Miliband was given the job. Those were people who were slightly skeptical maybe about net zero. They were worried about Red Ed and his supposedly socialist instincts. A section of the party would have opposed Shabana Mahmood, and these were the two touted candidates. These were the bookies' favourites, if I can put it that way. And I think by drawing on John Healey, he's neutralised that particular division that could have occurred. The problem is, of course, that John Healey resigned from the government only 5 weeks ago. I mean, political events move so quickly, but he only resigned as Defence Secretary on June the 11th. And the reason he resigned was because he didn't think the Treasury was giving him enough money as Secretary of State for Defence. Now he's in a position where he is the Chancellor, he's in charge of the department. So he will meet the commitment that he wanted when he was Defence Secretary, in which case he's got to stump up more billions, far more money. I think 3% was what he wanted by 2030 of GDP on defence, and when we're about 2.6 now. Or he doesn't do what he resigned for, as it were. So he doesn't actually achieve what he demanded as Defence Secretary. So either of those positions will be challenging.
Yeah, for sure. Look, as I said, you came to office promising a much bigger package to help with rising bills. Andy Burnham, 37 billion, I think, is the figure.
It was scored as something enormous. I think it was. My recollection was that in the initial scoring was much bigger than 37 billion, because energy prices were sky high. And I think having announced that, the Prime Minister announced it, I think, on her second day in the House of Commons. Then, of course, the mini budget came after that, and that was, in a way, what tipped the markets over the edge, because we were spending huge amounts of money, tens of billions. So it was the energy intervention followed by the tax cuts that really, I think, moved markets. Now, this 850 million is a smaller amount, but I was surprised to see that Darren Jones says it's unfunded. I mean, it's something that you would expect him perhaps to raise privately, but to do it in a public way that he did, it was pretty extraordinary.
Well, particularly as it was already unfunded under him beforehand. So
that's right. And also, I think, just to be a bit, not technical, but just to be a bit pedantic, most of these things are only funded at the time of the budget. So once, there are lots of policies that a government might commit to between budgets that aren't technically funded, because the only time you do the funding and the scoring and the OBR runs its ruler through it is at the time of the budget. So it's a bit of a grey area. And as you say, he was the minister responsible for it.
Yeah, indeed.
And he didn't complain about that at the time, the fact that it was unfunded.
Look, Kwasi, you've famously tried to present a budget that ripped up decades of economic orthodoxy, which didn't go brilliantly for reasons we probably haven't got time to get deep into. But Andy Burnham, he's promising to reverse the last 40 years of economic orthodoxy since Margaret Thatcher. What do you make of that?
So look, I think, and it's interesting, because I think the John Healey choice was very much someone that he feels that he can work with. I think Andy Burnham, much like Liz Truss, wants to, challenge orthodoxies. I don't think Liz talks about 40 years of neoliberalism, but, the scale of Andy Burnham, if we're taking him at his word, on this. The scale of the challenge is huge. And, we have to see what policies come from this. I strongly suspect, and he's headlined it, that it'll be a strong shift to the left. I think he hasn't ruled out wealth taxes, the equalization of capital gains tax and income tax, rent controls I've read about, and all of these things will have been briefed, or people in government will be aware of them. Journalists don't just, contrary to popular opinion, invent these things on their own.
It's nice of you to say
so. So you're right. So the fact that these things are being talked about in newspapers suggests that there is some discussion at the highest levels of government about these measures, and I think they're really, really seriously bad ideas.
Well, I was going to say, do you feel sort of invigorated as a Conservative? Because presumably there's quite a lot of the economic policy of the last 40 years, and particularly the first half of the last 40 years, on which you were quite keen.
Well, not only myself, but Andy Burnham himself was a cabinet minister for quite a while of those last 20 years. He was involved in government right up till 2010, I think, where he was in cabinet. And he got into parliament in 2001. So for a large part of those 40 years, at least a quarter of it, he was either a governing MP, backbencher, or more pertinently a minister and a cabinet minister. So it seems odd that he's ripping up, the legacy of a government which he served under.
Yeah. Look, when one declares war on economic orthodoxy, the forces of economic orthodoxy, as you learn yourself, push back quite hard. Yeah, but putting aside the fact that you don't necessarily agree with Andy Burnham's agenda, sure, what advice would you give him to avoid that happening to him, to smooth his way?
My very strong advice. I remember I read Liz Truss's sort of memoir, biography, whatever it was called, and she herself said that the Queen, her late Majesty, said to her, pace yourself. And I think, they've got 3 years. They've got at least 1 year, one full year, to deliver policies, which they can then bed in for another year or even 2. So, the idea that you're going to try and do everything in one budget, which I think was our biggest failing, is fanciful and will lead to bad outcomes. I think speed can lead to bad outcomes. I know the fashion is to grip everything and get everything done in the first 100 days or whatever, but actually I would urge caution on that.
Finally, to come back to John Healey, I mean, chancellors of the Exchequer have a reputation for ultimately going a bit native in the Treasury. What kind of pressures are going to be there on him that he's going to need to resist?
I think the biggest thing for him is the fact that he resigned from the Defence Secretary position because the Treasury weren't spending enough on defence. And I think this binary question, is he going to do what he asked for as Secretary of State for Defence, or rather will he do what his predecessor did to him and not give the money that the Defence Secretary asked for? And in West Streeting, you've got a very voluble, very media-savvy opponent, if I can put it that way, colleague, who will be really putting his feet to the fire on defence spending. So I think that's a big question that's specific to John Healey. Any other Labour MP who'd been made Chancellor wouldn't have had quite that pressure.
Yeah, indeed. Look, Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much indeed. Great to have your time and your expertise this morning. That's the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, speaking there.